Good morning, everyone. Just to let you know that there are more people trying to get in. We're doing our best to accommodate them to the side and behind me, and that means that I'll open a few minutes late. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. As far as possible, if you could now take your seats and either move into the hall, or if you're in the lobby there, round the corner to watch the TV screen. I think we've waited long enough to get everyone settled, so I will proceed. So good morning. I shall resume this inquiry into Purley Baptist Church, and this is day 2. Usual reminders to put your name on the attendance list and ensure your mobile devices don't ring while the inquiry is sitting. Just to let you know, I've been told that the proceedings are being filmed and recorded, and that the audio feed may not be switched off during intervals, so be careful what you say outside the inquiry, and the video will be edited and made available in due course, I'm told. So, usual arrangements. The adjournment for lunch will be at about 1 o'clock, and there'll be mid-morning and mid-afternoon breaks. In the interest of openness, I should tell you that I bumped into Mr. Katkowski at the station, and we walked here together, but we didn't discuss this case. We may have talked about another one we were involved in a few years ago. Today's programme is to hear, first of all, from Mr. Philp MP, and then to start on the applicant's witnesses. And I have heard officially that the department is now the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and that's still, the Secretary of State is still the Right Honourable Sajid Javid. I don't know what the abbreviation for the department will be, and though I've seen one or two tweets, I'm not going to speculate on what that'll settle down to. It used to be CLG, it'll be something else now. So, any other procedural housekeeping or administrative matters before we continue? Mr. Katkowski.
Briefly, so the final version of the Section 106 planning agreement is available. It's been distributed to others, but I'd just like to make sure that you've got your own copy of it. So shall we call this document 5?
Yes, please. Mr. King, have you got a copy of this? Okay. Thank you.
And so I'm just having walked over a list of various core documents I'm going to be taking the MP to in a few moments' time, just as advance notice of the things that need to come out of the box.
Thank you very much. Anything else? Then if I could invite Mr. Philp to come up to the witness table and to introduce himself, please.
Good, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Nicholson. And good morning, everybody. And by way of introduction, Mr. Nicholson, my name is Chris Philp. I was elected in May 2015 to serve as the Member of Parliament for Croydon South. Purley is pretty much in the middle of the parliamentary constituency of Croydon South, and I was re-elected as our neighbourhood's Member of Parliament at the general election in May 2017. And it's in that capacity that I'm appearing here today. I'd like to, actually just before I get into the substance of the topic, just put on record my thanks to the 7 residents' associations who are represented to my right, who have taken up the cause of representing residents in opposition to this application. They're all acting on a voluntary basis. They've done a fantastic job. They're obviously up against 2 of the most eminent planning QCs in the country. So I would just like to record my thanks and gratitude on behalf of the local community to these 7 resident associations who have spent most of their Christmas and New Year, and indeed most of their autumn, working very hard on their submissions. So my heartfelt thanks to you for the work that you've done.
While I'll let that go, for future reference, can I remind you that this is a public inquiry, not a public meeting, and that expressions of support or disagreement should be kept to yourselves. Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you. I should also just put on record that I'm not here as an expert witness. I'm not a qualified lawyer, nor do I have any professional qualifications in the area of planning. So I would just, Mr. Nicholson, appeal to you to treat me just as a local member of Parliament and not as an expert, because I'm not claiming to be a planning expert in any way, shape or form. So perhaps I could now move on to the substance of the application. An application for a 17-storey building just the other side of the wall there, and associated buildings the other side of Banstead Road. This was an application that was granted planning consent in December 2016. The planning committee were divided when they granted consent. But I would like to start by saying that I do accept fully the principle of developing something on that site, because it's got good transport links. I think we would all acknowledge that. The site has been vacant, I think, for something like 25 years, maybe even 30 years. I think there used to be a Sainsbury's standing there. So there is no question at all that site does need redeveloping. So I completely accept the principle of developing something on that site, and some sort of mixture of residential and commercial I think is entirely reasonable. However, in my opinion, for the development of that site to be suitable and acceptable, both to the local community, but also to be compliant with planning policy, I would suggest, Mr. Nicholson, that a height of something like 5 to 7 floors would be more appropriate. A development with suitable flood mitigation measures would be essential. And thirdly, a development that had suitable provision for parking. And the case I will present today suggests that the proposal as it stands does not meet those 3 criteria, and therefore is not suitable. And I would urge Mr. Nicholson in his recommendation to reject the application. So let me turn to the actual application, and I've got really 5 reasons why I believe this application should be rejected. Can everyone hear, by the way, at the back? Okay. Sometimes people say they'd rather not hear, but hopefully that doesn't apply. So the first, and I think most important reason why I think this is an unsuitable application, completely unsuitable and inappropriate application, is the height of that tower, 17 floors. Now the rest of Purley is between 4 and 5 floors, so this building is around about 4 times taller than the next tallest building in Purley. And in fact, you've got to go probably to Croydon Town Centre, about 3 miles away, before you find another building anything like this tall. So if this building is built, it will be the tallest building for some miles around. And I think it will fundamentally change the character of Purley as a place adversely, because Purley is a peaceful, quiet, suburban town, market centre. It is not the sort of place where one should build, in my view, 17-storey buildings. People have chosen to live here because it has a peaceful and suburban feel to it. And if this proposal is allowed, I believe that peaceful and suburban character will be fundamentally and adversely altered. And I think that is the main grounds, in my view, for refusing this application, the totally inappropriate height. Now, that is obviously my opinion, but I believe there are some quite clear planning policies which are consistent with the view that I've just expressed. So firstly, I would like to refer to Croydon's, which one's this? This is the emerging local plan, the detailed policies. So it's the document that was published, I think, in August 2017. It's the emerging detail. It hasn't been adopted yet, but it's very close to being adopted. And policy DM16 in that document says that tall buildings, and this undoubtedly counts as a tall building, it's materially taller than anything else in the area, it says tall buildings should respect and enhance local character. It says that in section D. And in section C, it says tall buildings should conserve and enhance the setting of local assets in the wider historic environment. And I don't think this application respects or enhances the local character. In fact, I would say it is manifestly at odds with the local character of Purley. It completely abuses and contradicts the local character of the area. And on your walk from the station this morning, Mr. Nicholson, assuming Mr. Katowski's conversation did not distract you with its dazzling wit, you would have, which I'm sure it did, you will have noticed as you walked over that a 17-storey building in that location would just be completely out of keeping with everything else in the town centre. So I think it contradicts that policy. That's the first policy that I believe this proposal contradicts. But there are more. I would secondly like to refer to the London Plan, which is currently in force. That's the London Plan updated in 2016. Now, I know there was a draft new London Plan published for consultation on November the 29th, 2017, but that was a first draft. It hasn't been consulted upon, so given it's at such an early stage, I would suggest, Mr. Nicholson, we should disregard that for this purpose and concentrate on the 2016 local plan that is in force. And policy 7.7 of the 2016 London Plan is the relevant policy. It's a policy that talks specifically about tall buildings. Now, it says that tall buildings, where they're built, should be plan-led, and we'll come on to the local plan in a minute. But it then lays down a series of further criteria. Now, the existence of a local plan does not mean those other criteria should be disregarded at all. And therefore it is relevant, I think, we consider those other criteria laid out in section 7.7 of the London Local Plan. It says in 7.7a, tall and large buildings should not have an unacceptably harmful impact on their surroundings. Well, I believe this building has exactly that harmful impact. 7.7c, subsection B, said tall buildings may only be considered in areas whose character would not be adversely affected by the scale, mass or bulk of a large tall building. And again, I think the character of Purley would be massively adversely affected by a building of this bulk. It goes on to say in section C, subsection C, tall buildings must relate well to the form and proportion, scale, and character of surrounding buildings, particularly at street level. Well, it clearly doesn't relate well to the scale, I use that word scale, of the existing buildings, because the scale of the surrounding buildings is 3 to 4, at the most 5 floors. So it fails that test. And if anyone subsequently wishes to quibble about the definition of tall buildings, paragraph 7.25 defines tall buildings as being substantially taller than their surroundings. So there is no question per para 7.25 that this does count as a tall building. And I would make one further point. Paragraph 7.27 says that tall buildings should form part of a cohesive building group. I emphasise the word group. This proposed building is not part of a group. It is a standalone building, which will, in my view, be an eyesore on the horizon. But it fails that test in paragraph 7.27, that it should form part of a cohesive group. There is no cohesive group being proposed here, nor indeed in the emerging local plan. So, Mr. Nicholson, I would submit that section 7.7 of the London Plan is comprehensively contradicted and violated by this proposal. It doesn't fit in with the scale. The character of Purley would be adversely affected. Now, in terms of the local plan in Croydon, there are 2 or 3 local plan documents that we should consider. We've got some that are in force and some that are emerging, although very nearly adopted. So I think it's reasonable to consider both. If we look at the existing strategic policies, the ones adopted in March 2013, so strategic policies existing, paragraph 7.58 says that residential development must respect the existing residential character of an area. And in my view, given that all of Purley is semi-detached and detached 1920s, 1930s houses, a bit of 3 to 4 floor flats around the High Street and Brighton Road. This proposal clearly does not respect the existing residential character. It makes it something completely different. Now, the emerging strategic local plan, the one published in August 2017, I think it's called CLP 1.1, at paragraph 7.59, so they clearly inserted a paragraph in between the two versions somewhere, it says specifically in relation to Purley, it says, it makes a very similar point. It says residential development in Purley Town Centre should, and I quote, respect the existing residential character. And once again, a 17-floor building does not respect the existing character of Purley. So I believe this proposal violates both the in-force local plan, the one from 2013, CLP1, and also the emerging local plan, CLP 1.1, published in August 2017, that's very nearly been adopted. So there is a second policy, in fact, a third policy, which this application contradicts. Let me turn now to some other clauses in those two documents, the Strategic Policies 1 and 1.1. Conveniently, the policy on tall buildings, which is policy SP4, is the same policy number in both documents, and the wording is exactly the same. Clearly no one decided to change it between 2013 and 2017. So the wording is the same. And it says, it does say that tall buildings can be considered in district centres, and Purley is a district centre. However, in SP 4.5, it says very clearly that we must be sensitive to potentially inappropriate tall buildings, and any application for a tall building must, and it uses this same phrase again, respect and enhance local character. Well, this doesn't respect and enhance the local character. It is totally at odds with the local character. The local character is 3 to 4 floors and 1920s family housing. It does not respect and enhance the local character. And it says it must include high quality public realm. Well, I know there are some community facilities, the church hall, which that's a good thing, but as far as I can see, there isn't any external public realm in this proposal. But the main point is this respect and enhance local character. It doesn't respect and enhance the local character. So there's a fourth policy which is contradicted. The national documents, so we've considered the London planning documents, we've considered the local planning documents, and I'll come on to comment on those further in a moment. But there's also, of course, the national planning framework, and that is expressed via the National Planning and Policy Framework, published in 2012. And at paragraph 58, subsection 4, it says that planning policies and decisions should ensure that development responds to and respects and reflects local character and local surroundings. Well, once again, this proposal does not respect or reflect or respond to local character. This proposal is totally at odds with the local character of Purley. So, Mr. Nicholson, I've given my view as a local Member of Parliament, but I've also identified 5 planning policies at every level, national, London and local, which I believe this 17-floor proposal flagrantly violates. Now, there is one reference in the local planning documents which the developer and their QCs may refer to. In fact, I would expect they will refer to it. So let me preempt that by referring to it now. And that appears in the emerging detailed local policies called CLP2 in the August 2017 draft. So it hasn't quite been adopted, but it's nearly been adopted. And in particular, there is a policy in there which is called DM 44.1. And policy DM 44.1 says that development in Purley, in fact 44.1b, says development in Purley should complement the existing predominant building heights of 3 to 8 stories with the potential for a new landmark building of up to 16 stories. And there was a previous version of the plan that talked about 14 stories. Now, I have a number of issues with that. Now, if the applicant seeks to rely on that, I would make a number of points in pre-rebuttal, if I may, Mr. Nicholson. One is the policy is based on a factual error. The predominant building heights in Purley are not 3 to 8 stories. As your stroll from the station will have indicated, unless Mr. Katowski was successful in distracting you, would clearly have, a simple visual inspection would clearly indicate there is no building in Purley readily identifiable of 8 stories. The tallest one I can see is the red brick one on the corner of the Purley Cross Directory and the High Street. The red brick one, it's about 4 floors, and if you include the sort of roof mansard thing, you might get to 5 stories. So policy DM 44.1b is based on a factually inaccurate premise. Secondly, it refers to the potential for a landmark building. Now, I would take issue with the fact there should be a landmark building or 16-floor building or 17-floor building in Purley at all. But the simple reference to the potential does not mean the application should be granted. Potential is an extremely weak formulation. There might be the potential for all kinds of things. Doesn't mean to say one should do them or that you should grant a planning application. So what I think we see here is one piece of planning policy based on a factually inaccurate premise referring to the potential for a tall building. Ranged against that are 5 very clear, very explicit planning policies which point in the opposite direction. So if this is simply a contest based on planning policy, I would submit that the case for refusal is 5 points to refusal and half a point for, I'll be generous and say half a point. I'm a generous man. Half a point for granting the application. So I think the planning policy case is overwhelming. Now, I am aware that public opinion is not, legally speaking, considered to be a material planning consideration. However, quite clearly there is a matter of judgment to be made here, Mr. Nicholson, by you in due course, as to whether this 17-floor building respects and enhances the local character or whether it violates it. Because if your belief is that it does not respect and it is not consistent with the local environment, it's quite clear planning policy says you should refuse this application. If, on the other hand, you believe that this proposal for a 17-floor building in an area comprising consistently 3 to 4 floor buildings, if you think that's somehow consistent, then you would be within your rights to grant the application. Now, I think in you deciding, Mr. Nicholson, whether or not this 17-floor building is consistent, it is relevant to consider what local people think, because after all, local people have lived here for decades and know the area better than anyone, principally, of course, the 7 local residents' associations. So I think it is relevant, as you make that determination, to think about local opinion. 7 local residents' associations, representing 35,000 local people, oppose this application. The local MP, myself, opposes the application. I was re-elected a few months ago by 33,334 local people, or 33,332 if I exclude myself and my wife. I'm making the perhaps dangerous assumption that my wife voted for me. I hope that's a justified assumption. Our London Assembly member, Steve O'Connell, who I think is speaking later on, opposes this application. He was elected by 70,156 people in May 2016. I've also conducted an online survey, which I've submitted. 11,933 people replied to that. 11,933, many of whom I suspect are sitting here. And about 95.44% of those people registered an objection, and they almost all came from the postcode CR8, which is the postcode round here, postcode CR5, which is essentially Coulsdon, just a mile down the road, and postcode CR2, which is mostly Selsdon and Sanderstead, which is about a mile up Brighton Road and up the hill in the other direction. So all local people. 95.44% of 11,933. Now, in my 2.5 years as a Member of Parliament, I've done a number of local surveys. on various issues, and this is by far the one that has attracted the most responses and attention. We have local councillors. The vast majority of local councillors are opposed in this area, are opposed to this application, many of whom I think will be speaking later. And finally, when this original application was heard by the council received 616 responses, of which 89% objected. So while I accept that public opinion is not a material planning consideration, it is quite clear that the overwhelming majority of local public opinion agrees with me and agrees with the residents' associations that this building is out of keeping, out of character, and fails those policy tests. There is one resident association in favour of the application, or their committee is. Their residents, I think, have a slightly different view. And there is one of whom clearly is sitting there. And there is also a business association that's in favour. So if one weighs the scales, there is no question about where the balance of local judgment lies. Local judgment is that this proposal is totally out of keeping, would fundamentally change the character of the area, and it fails those 5 planning policy tests. And that is my main reason for objecting. But there are 4 others, which I'll go through. You'll be relieved to hear slightly more quickly. The second ground why I think this should be rejected is that it flagrantly exceeds the London Plan's own density guidelines. The London Plan lays down quite clear guidelines for density, which for a site like this is between 200 and 700 habitable rooms per hectare. Not a very intuitive measure, but there it is. It's policy 3.4 and table 3.2 in the 2016 London Plan. I don't think anyone disputes that. The council, very helpfully, in their statement of case, for which I thank them, dated June 2017. Anyway, their original statement of case, on page 20, clause 8.21, specifies what the density is in this development. Now, the original planning application got it wrong. They said it was 717 rooms per hectare. Actually, it's 817, so clearly higher than the London Plan guideline of 700. But if you break it down between the island site, that's the site behind that wall where the skyscraper is going to go, and the south site, that's the site, the other side of Banstead Road, the density on the Banstead Road bit is 649 habitable rooms per hectare. That is within guidelines. And actually, I have very little objection to the development over there. However, on the skyscraper site, the island site, the one just here, behind the grey hoardings, the density there is 1,052 habitable rooms per hectare. Now, that is 82% higher than the midpoint of the acceptable range. The midpoint is 450, that's halfway between 200 and 700, and it is 50% higher than the top end of the range. The top end of the range is 700. So the proposal exceeds the London Plan's own density requirement on that island site by 50%. And again, I would submit that that flagrant breach of the London Plan is very sound planning grounds for refusal. My third reason for urging refusal is damage to a protected view. Now, in my reading of all of these planning documents, which I have to say was not the most entertaining task I've ever undertaken, I discovered in the saved policies from the Croydon Unitary Development Plan 2006, which is still partly in force, I discovered a policy, UD11. And that policy, UD11, still in force, albeit 11 years old, says that the council will ensure that all new development will not have an adverse impact on certain designated panoramas and local views. Now, I discovered, on further reading, in paragraph 4.65, that one of those protected views, specifically view CP5, Charlie Papa 5, is the view from Farthing Downs. Now, I know Farthing Downs quite well because I go running there pretty much every weekend. In fact, I managed to set a personal best of 28 minutes in getting from my house to the Fox pub in Caulsden and back a week or so ago. 28 minutes and 11 seconds. And if you stand on Ditches Lane, which is the road that goes, tarmacked road that goes along the top of Farthing Down. So Farthing Down, by the way, Mr. Nicholson, is this very beautiful open space. It's a down, it's a hill, as the name implies. It overlooks Caulsden and beyond that Purley. It's owned by the Corporation of London. It's a sort of protected, very lovely open space which we all use. I
do plan to go there.
Good. Well, I would recommend that very strongly. And if you can beat my time of 28 minutes and 11 seconds from Caulsden to the Fox and back, I'd be very impressed.
Well, I could get a taxi.
It's better for your health to run. Now, as you go down Ditches Lane, the high point is at 147 metres. But if you go down the road a bit, north or northeast, you come to the 135 metre contour. Now, from the point at which the 135 metre contour intersects the lane, if you look from there in a direction that's about, I mean, this is just a rough reckoning because I'm not a surveyor, obviously. If you look at about, where are we? 15 degrees, 30 degrees east of due north, that is the direction of the proposed 17-floor building, and the direct line of sight. And the highest point between that place on Ditches Lane, on Farthing Down, and the site just there, the highest point on that direct line of sight is a road called Hartley Down, just around the corner from where Diane lives, and that is about 100 metres above sea level. The top of the building, so the base of that building, is about, so where we're sitting now, or just a bit below where we're sitting now, is 65 metres above sea level, and the building, by my reckoning, is about 60 metres tall. So the top of that building will be 125 metres above sea level. So, I mean, again, I'm not a surveyor, but if you're standing at a point 135 metres above sea level, the highest, and you're looking at something that's 125 metres above sea level, so about the same height, and the highest point between those two levels is 100 metres, you've got a clear 25 or 30 metre intrusion. And I've, in my submission, I've done a little red dot on a shot from Google Maps. Now, I'm not claiming that this is done with hugely scientific precision, but it just illustrates where I think the building will pop up above the skyline. So I think that this will actually, not only will it impose itself visually on the surrounding area here, it'll loom over Purley Cross, in my view, dominate the local area adversely. I think it will also damage this protected view in CD UP 2006. And for good measure, the London Plan 2016, our old friend 7.7, Section D, subsection B, also says, for good measure, tall buildings should not impact on local or strategic views adversely. So I will add that to the pile of reasons for refusal. There are two more, which are more technical, and I don't pretend to be technically expert in these areas. But the fourth reason is flood risk. Now, the flood risk assessment prepared in connection with this application is I would say, quite dismissive of the flood risk. It admits there is a Zone 1 flood risk area around Purley Cross, but it says that it only narrowly impacts upon this site. And there's a map, it's figure 3, and figure 3 has some blue shading which indicates, I think, the sort of most acute flood risk zone. It covers the gyratory, but it only just touches on this site. I think you're probably familiar with the map, but I've got a copy here if you'd like to look at it.
I'm sure I've got it. I won't hold you up now.
Okay, well, let's...
I'll let you finish and then look at it later.
It's this map here.
Yeah.
And you see that the blue is the flood, and it just touches the edge of the site.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, the flood risk assessment talks about surface water flooding, but it barely mentions the Caterham Bourne. Now, on your pleasant perambulation earlier, you will not have seen a river. There's no river that you would think. But actually, there is a river called the Caterham Bourne, which runs underground from the direction of Caterham along the A22. That's the road that comes out onto the railway bridge, and it runs almost under where we're sitting, and on it goes towards Sutton. Now, the Caterham Bourne is very prone to bursting and flooding. It's in this underground culvert. the culvert is not big enough, and so there's a whole piece of massive engineering that the Environment Agency are kind of working on to fix that, but there's no current specific plan in place. They're talking about it, but haven't actually done anything yet. And on a fairly frequent basis, this Caterham-borne underground river bursts out. And that happened most recently, I think, in March 2014.
So please, just give your evidence.
Yes, okay. Well, I'm speaking from memory, or February 2014. And the whole underpass and the whole gyratory system were underwater. So I think that clearly illustrates there is a flood risk, a material flood risk here. The CLP1 and CLP 1.1, so the strategic local plans, both the 2013 one in force and the 2017 one that's about to be adopted, both say at paragraph 6.6, it's the same paragraph in both versions. The new one says that the strategic flood risk assessment identifies significant episodes of surface water flooding at Purley Cross, and the old version says that the strategic flood risk assessment from 2009 says there is a risk of fluvial flooding in a number of places, including here. So both sets of strategic policies, 2013 and 17, identify this as a strategic, as a flood risk area. Now, there is also a document that was prepared by the council after the most recent episode of flooding. So the episode of flooding that happened around about January, February 2014, the council did a report, or a company commissioned by the council called URS, did a report on that flooding, and the council did another report, which I'm just trying to lay my hands on, if you can bear with me. Yeah, here it is. The council did another report more recently in October 2016, which is titled Flood Investigation Report, 24th of August 15. I'm not sure if you have a copy of that. Now, in that report, there are some photographs of Purley Cross just here underwater, demonstrating it's not made up. But there's also a map, which is figure 4.1 on page 10. Now, the map on page 10, figure 4.1, also has blue shading, indicating areas of high flood risk. But the blue shading is rather different to the blue shading on the report that came with the planning application. And on this map, with blue shading, it's only a year and a half old, there is blue shading going right through the middle of the proposed development site. It's just there, I'm just pointing to it.
Thank you.
Indeed, it goes behind, it's detailed enough that I can see it goes behind that wall there, so I hope you've brought your wellies if it starts raining. So this map, produced by the council in 24th of August 2015, shows quite clearly there is a flood risk here, and the strategic flood risk assessment, done independently of the planning application, shows the same thing. So I find the rather airy dismissal in the flood risk assessment accompanying the planning application to be wholly unconvincing and directly at odds with the council's independent work and also our own experience. And you've got photographs showing the whole area underwater. So I think if we are going to have a development on that site, and as I said at the beginning, I do accept the principle, there needs to be very significant flood mitigation measures. For example, some kind of raised podium so that the lowest floor in occupation, whether commercially or residentially, is above the level which might in the future get inundated. Now, while there is some reference to bunds in this application, the kind of flood mitigation measures that I believe are appropriate, given the massive flood event we saw at this site just 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, this application doesn't have those adequate flood mitigation measures. And of course, the National Planning and Policy Framework, at paragraph 100, says that development is inappropriate in areas at high risk of flooding. I think we should develop the site, but it should simply have proper mitigation measures, which this application does not have, for the reason that their own flood risk assessment is inadequate and ignores all of the council's other flood risk assessment work. So that is grounds number 4 for refusal. Grounds number 5, which Mr Nicholson will be relieved to hear is the last grounds for refusal, are the parking and traffic arrangements. Now, it's very striking that this development has 220 flats, and yet it only has, and of course a large church, which has an extremely large Sunday congregation, thanks to its excellent minister, who I see sitting over there. I think the parking arrangements are not adequate. It has 50 parking spaces for the church, but that's not the main thrust of my objection. The main thrust of my objection is that for the 220 flats, it only has 37 parking spaces, which is wholly inadequate. Now, the council itself admits that that is wholly inadequate. In the council's statement of case, again, I think submitted around about June of this year, they themselves concede, and they conceded it in the original planning committee report as well, at paragraph 8.55 of the council's statement of case, they concede that if you apply the sort of standard rates of car ownership for this ward, Purley, you would have 165 cars using this development, and yet there are only 37 car parking spaces, I think 20 of which are restricted for disabled use, so actually only about 17 for general use. Now, it's quite clear to me that if you have 165 people wanting to use cars and only 37 parking spaces, you will have parking chaos on the streets of Purley. You will have other residents unable to use the streets outside their houses. The prospective new residents of this development will not be able to park anywhere. It will cause parking chaos. And the fact that the multi-storey car park, some little distance away, is quite empty on a Sunday or Saturday, obviously in no way mitigates the fact that on a Tuesday morning, residents won't be able to park there because it's full with commuters and people using the town centre and everything else. So it is wholly inadequate. Now, the traffic assessment, as I understand it, that was done with the application, at paragraph 4.33, rather absurdly asserts, without evidence, that the limited number of parking spaces simply means the residents just won't use cars. As if by some act of God, people will choose to disregard their cars because there aren't enough parking spaces in the building. Well, I mean, I can say from personal experience that is a farcical suggestion. And what will, of course, happen is that people will just use unrestricted places on the surrounding streets and put unacceptable pressure on those parking spaces. And the NPPF, paragraph 29, says, it talks about the need for sustainable transport, which we all support, but it also says people should have a choice about how they travel. And by restricting the number of spaces like this, it is denying people the choice which they are guaranteed or granted under NPPF paragraph 29. So in fact, the traffic assessment, which asserts there'll be a reduction in car use by these people, is flatly contradicted by the council's own calculation, which says it's 165 spaces that are needed. So the spaces will be about 5 times oversubscribed. There will also be an issue, obviously, with lots of cars coming in and out of the very busy roads. People probably coming here today had trouble crossing the roads, Banstead Road there, and Russell Hill just behind the wall there. Clearly having lots of extra vehicle movements will make that worse. I would suggest the way to deal with that is simply have a smaller building. If the building was 7 stories rather than 17, you'd have obviously fewer flats and therefore fewer cars. So a solution, Mr Nicholson, is readily at hand, which is simply to build a smaller building. So in summary, before I submit myself for what I hope will be a gentle interrogation by the learned gentleman opposite, there are 5 reasons why this should be rejected. The main one of which is that this 17-floor building is totally out of keeping with the local area. It's totally out of character. It will fundamentally change the character of Purley Town Centre in a way that violates 5 separate planning policies. This development flagrantly contradicts density levels by 50% on the island site. 1,052 habitable rooms compared to a guideline of 700. It spoils a protected view. It does not have adequate flood mitigation measures, bearing in mind this area frequently floods, and the council themselves admit that in their own map shows this site itself, where we're sitting now, is a flood risk area. And finally, it will cause parking chaos. The public agree with the view that I've articulated in overwhelming numbers. 95% of those surveyed, the overwhelming majority of local residents, local councillors, local residents associations. So the judgment, the qualitative judgment about whether this building fits in or not is firmly, very overwhelmingly on the side of rejection. And as the local Member of Parliament, I simply politely but strongly urge you, Mr Nicholson, to reject this application and encourage the applicants to come forward in due course with a more suitable application which will develop the site but will protect and preserve the character of our town centre. Thank you.
Thank you. Quiet, please. Quiet, please. Mr. Katkowski, you'd indicated about half an hour. Is that about right?
Might be a little bit longer than that.
Would it be sensible to take a break now? How are you fixed? Okay.
Mind either way.
Okay, we'll proceed. Mr. Philp, I see that you've got your phone there. Generally speaking, I don't allow witnesses to be prompted by anyone else or anything else. I appreciate that you might suddenly be called to number 10, though I think that was yesterday.
You were waiting by the phone yesterday, weren't you? But the call didn't come.
I'll allow you to keep that there, but I'd just ask that you don't look at any messages that might relate to this case.
Well, I was just checking the time, and let me give you a categoric assurance that no one has sent me a message. I don't expect anyone to, and I certainly don't need to be prompted by anyone.
Splendid. Mr. Katkowski.
Good. Thanks very much indeed. The Reverend Dr. Collins tells me this reminds him of 11:15 on Sunday mornings, seeing all these people here. These very well-attended services. Right. Now then, I'm through the points in your... You set out your...
They can't hear you. You're cutting in and out.
There's a sound problem. Yeah, I think you... Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, I think you probably are. Here comes a technician. Here we go. Another microphone.
That's very technical. I don't know whether that's made any difference or not. But I'm going to follow your points through in the order in which you raised them in your written statement, for which many thanks. That's the one of the 14th of December. So we'll start with the tall building point, which you describe as your... I'm hesitating, I don't really want to shout at you, Mr. Phillips, although perhaps I should. I'm going to start with your tall building point, which as I understand it is your main ground of objection to the proposal.
One of the five, yes.
One of the five, but in fairness to both of us, you yourself say the issue of excessive height is the main ground for refusal.
Yes.
So of the five, this is your main point. That's not to say there aren't five, but this is your main point, yes?
Indeed.
Indeed, good. And as I understand the point about the objection to the tall building element of our proposals, it's an objection along these lines, that because of the prevailing scale and height of buildings in Purley Town Centre, the district centre, that Purley itself is simply not a suitable location, an appropriate location for a tall building. That's the gist of the point, isn't it?
Yes, I would say that in general, Purley is not suitable for a 17-storey building, but I didn't make the point in my evidence, but since you raise it, I also think this specific, even if one accepted the general premise that you should have a tall building, I think this specific building is inappropriate for the other four reasons I raised, and there may be design grounds as well. So I think it's generally inappropriate to have a 17-floor building, but even if one thought you could have one, I think this specific building is inappropriate for the 4 other reasons.
Yes, well, we'll come to the 4 other reasons, but just in relation to the notion of having a tall building in Purley, that is a point which relates, that point itself relates to Purley as a whole, doesn't it? It isn't something which is specific to this particular site. It's not as if you're saying, well, a 17-storey building could be appropriate or would be appropriate somewhere else in Purley, but just not on this site. Do you see my point?
I do see your point,
Yes.
and you are correct to say that were an application to come forward for a 17-storey building somewhere else, I would obviously study it, but would most likely be in opposition for the reasons I outlined. But I certainly think it is inappropriate on this specific site as well, given its location and everything, and its prominence and everything else.
Yes, but there's nothing particular about this site that makes it any different from anywhere else in Purley in relation to the notion of a tall building.
Well, I've made the point already that I would likely be generally opposed to the principle of a tall 17-floor building anywhere. But I do think there are some, but I take issue with the second limb of your question or assertion, which is that I do think there are some particular things about this site. Principally its prominence. I mean, it is the very centre of Purley. It is exceptionally visible from the surrounding areas. So I think it does have a prominence in the Purley townscape, which other sites may not have. So I do think there are particular reasons, as well as general reasons, for taking exception to a 17-floor building on this site.
But if the idea of having a landmark building in Purley is bought into, if one considers that it's a good idea to have a landmark building in Purley, then being at the very centre of Purley, as you've just described it, and being in a prominent location might be thought to be a good location for a landmark building if one is to have one at all, rather than in a more peripheral.
Quiet, please, everyone. I would ask you to give everyone who's participating in this inquiry due respect, and that means not interrupting. Laughter and applause aren't appropriate public inquiries. If I have a lot of disruption like that, I'll have to adjourn. Now, please give everyone the respect that they're due. Thank you. Please continue, Mr. Katkowski.
Well, some people might think that. I am certainly not one of them, and I don't think other people here are either.
Thank you. Good. Let's work our way through the planning policy documents, or some aspects of those. And you referred yourself to the London plan, do you recall? So now, are you accessing the documents on screen, which is fine?
Okay,
great.
I'm looking at the London plan on my screen.
That's very, very helpful.
I'm looking
because it would
specifically at
save
page 293, policy 7.7.
Exactly, because that would save the programme officer having to dig the
That's fine,
boxes,
I've got it here.
digging the boxes. Right, so Sarah, if you could have policy 7.7, page 293 of the London plan. You refer to this point yourself, and it is just at the very beginning of the policy. We saw this yesterday with the residents' associations. Tall buildings should be part of a plan-led approach to changing or developing an area by the identification of appropriate, sensitive and inappropriate locations. So the London plan's cue, if you like, or theme here is that if you're going to have tall buildings, well, I was going to say ideally, but it's more positive than that, the London plan is advocating that should be dealt with through a plan-led approach. That's what this document says.
Yes, now let me address that point. And I did touch on it in my remarks, anticipating you would say this. So it does say in section A that large buildings should be part of a plan-led approach. That is entirely correct. And of course, we'll talk about Croydon's plan, I'm sure, in a moment. However, policy 7.7 goes on to list a range of criteria in sections B and C, which I went through. Now, simply the mere existence of a Croydon local plan, or a local plan anywhere for that matter, does not render invalid or superfluous the points in sections B and C. Well, you seem to be implying. Let me finish the point.
Can you let him finish his answer? If he goes off on a tangent, then I'll try and bring him back.
He's off on one at the moment.
No, I disagree.
Well,
because I think the premise
Mr.
of
Phil, the way I like these, and I know you're not an expert, I'll make sure that Mr. Katkowski doesn't interrupt you too much. But what I like is if you could try and answer his question, then I'll make sure you've got time to qualify it, but I will ask you to stick to the point.
So I agree with your point that it says it should be part of a plan-led approach.
Thank you.
But if the premise of the question is to suggest that the other criteria in sections B and C do not apply,
It isn't.
or should, it's not. Okay, fine.
Thank you. premise of the question, the next question, though, in relation to that point, is if you look at item B of the policy, the self-same policy, we're told applications for tall buildings should include an urban design analysis that demonstrates the proposal is part of a strategy that will meet the criteria below. And the criteria below are the ones in item C that you've referred to. The next sentence, though, says, this is particularly important, so implies less important otherwise, if the site is not identified as a location for tall or large buildings and the borough's LDF is the jargon for the local plan. So do you see? So the idea is the criteria are seen as particularly important if you haven't followed a plan-led approach. It doesn't tell us how important or otherwise they are if you have followed a plan-led approach. Do you see the point, though?
Well, I do see the point you're raising. So it does say they are particularly important, the criteria. So these are the criteria for the benefit of others.
Yes.
The things like you can't be out of proportion, etc. Are the ones I read out earlier. So I understand they're particularly important if there's no plan. But if there is a plan, that's not to say they should be disregarded.
I'm not suggesting that.
They're still relevant. They're still relevant, and that is why I referred to them.
I'm not suggesting they're irrelevant. Now, then, as you know, in the chain, because you have mugged up on all these policies, in the chain...
I'd like to be thorough, Mr. Kozowski.
Indeed so. The local plan for Croydon at policy SP 4.5, so if you're using this on screen again, that's great. This is core document for the inspector's benefit, 10.1, and it's page 38.
Hang on a sec. Are we on the 2013 version or the 2017 version?
It's no different, I don't think, for this particular point. So I was on the 2013 version. But
Okay, 2013 version, hang on.
if that's all right. I mean, I'm happy to go to the other version. If that,
No, I've got it, that's fine, I've got it. I've got both versions. I've got both versions open.
Fine.
So, okay. Hang on a sec. CLP, hang on a sec. So it's CLP 1 2013. Hang on.
Yeah.
Okay, which
And it's
page?
policy SP4.
0.5.
SP 4.5.
0.5.
Tall buildings policy on page 38. I don't know.
Yes,
if
there,
got
yeah.
it, got
Got
it.
it,
yeah,
well done.
got it.
Good. And as you will know, I'm sure, that Croydon has taken that lead from the London plan point that you should have a plan-led approach to working out where tall buildings might or might not be appropriate. Because in policy SP 4.5 in the Croydon local plan, we're told that, first of all, proposals for tall buildings will be encouraged only in, and first of all, that there's the Croydon opportunity area, but then second are areas and district centres. Do you see? So in that first sentence, there's encouragement for tall buildings, but restricted
Yes.
to,
Yes.
for our purposes, the relevant part of
Yes.
it is areas and district
Yes.
centres. So we've moved from the London plan saying have a plan-led approach to the local plan picking that up and starting off with a proposition that the only places they're going to encourage tall buildings are in these listed areas, one of which is in district centres.
Forgive me if I may. The London plan did refer to a plan-led approach, qualified by the criteria in sections B and C. A plan-led approach qualified by the criteria in sections B and C.
The whole point is that when you follow a plan-led approach, you are to, in following that approach, to look at those criteria when deciding whether an area is appropriate or inappropriate for tall buildings.
With great respect, it does. In referring to these, the plan, it says that the application should still have regard to the points in B and C.
I'm not, as you know, I'm not disputing that or disagreeing with that. We're on the plan-led approach at the moment. Do you see? So the first point in SP 4.5 is that one of the locations where tall buildings are encouraged. Notice the positive nature of that. Encouraged is in district centres.
Yes, I see that.
And we are obviously, as you know, in a district centre.
I accept that as well.
Thank you. Now, if one's wondering, well, quite what does that mean as a matter of more detail? If you read on to the, if your page looks the same as mine, to the bottom of the same column,
Yes.
it says detailed, last sentence on that column, detailed criteria for the assessment of tall buildings, and it's this: consideration of the appropriateness of tall buildings on individual sites and or in district centres will be contained in the Croydon local plan, detailed policies, etc. plan.
Yes.
All right, so this part of the policy is looking forward, if you like, to the next plan to
Yes.
come. So if you want to know what all this means in detail, we're being told, aren't we? Well, look to the next plan.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But before we go there, Mr. Kotowski, I suspect that's your next move, but before we go to the detailed plan, we should consider the following paragraph, SP 4.6. So having made the points you just made, all of which I accept, it goes on to say, some locations within the areas, so I'm on SP 4.6 now, some locations within the areas listed in SP 4.5, including this one, will be sensitive to or inappropriate for tall buildings. And applications for tall buildings, so notwithstanding the detailed plan you're about to talk about, it will be inappropriate for tall buildings, and applications for tall buildings will be required to respect and enhance local character, minimise environmental impacts, make a positive contribution to the skyline, and include high-quality public realm. So notwithstanding the contents of the detailed plan that we are about to discuss, this plan nonetheless requires applications for tall buildings in this area to respect and enhance local character. So whatever the detailed local plan may say, that does not diminish in any way this requirement for this application to respect and enhance the local character, which in my submission this application does not do.
I understand that, and we're not for one moment arguing that these criteria are beside the point. We have a difference of opinion as to whether they're met or not. But my point here that I'm asking you about is the plan and approach to working out whether the notion of a tall building in Purley is appropriate or inappropriate. That's what I'm asking you about. We're going to follow the chain through. But as you've raised this point again about this criteria, can I just flush out whether there's, if you like, a fundamental philosophical difference perhaps between the parties here? Can I just ask you this? Is it your opinion that one can only respect and enhance local character by being the same or similar to that which exists? Or do you not recognise that one can respect and enhance by being different to that which exists?
Well, that is a philosophical, some might say even theological question.
Let's not go there.
But since you've, no, I'm not invoking divine support. Since you asked the question,
I do.
I would say that in areas like this, long established, suburban residential areas, there is a certain level of tolerance. You know, you can move a certain distance away from the existing built form and still be seen to respect and enhance the area. There comes a threshold, and anyone, I think including the applicant, any of us would accept there is a threshold. There comes a point at which you've moved so far away from the existing buildings that you are no longer respecting and enhancing. So the judgment which Mr. Nicholson must make is does this application exceed or fall short of that threshold? Now, I would say that a building that is 4 times higher, 5 times higher, anything else for some miles around, far crosses the threshold of respecting and enhancing. Now,
so what's the answer? I'm going to interrupt you. What's the answer to my question?
Where would I draw the line?
What's the answer to my
yes,
question?
Well, if you're asking where would I draw the line,
no, I'm not asking you that, as you very well know. Shall I repeat my question to you? If you listen to it carefully, and if you could do me the courtesy of starting with a straightforward answer to it, and then fine if you want to qualify it, that's absolutely all right. So, listen carefully and please. Can one only respect and enhance local character by being the same or similar to that which exists? Or do you accept that one can respect and enhance local character by being different to that which exists?
A little different within reason.
Right, a little different. So that I would think is within the word similar to. So I think your position is you either have to be the same or similar to that which exists, the little different point.
Broadly, yeah.
Okay, fine.
But
so
to
in other words,
to give you a sort of concrete illustration on this side, I mean, having established that the buildings around here are 4 to 5 stories, 7 floors, one could live with. That's sort of broadly within the same sort of. It's
that's
a bit
similar.
higher.
That's a similar.
I would say 7 floors would fall within the similar definition.
Exactly. That's what I'm putting to you. So in those circumstances, the result of your philosophy, if you like, or your approach, is that one could never have a tall building in an area which doesn't have existing buildings of about the stature that you're proposing. Now, if one adopted that approach, I mean, there'd be a great number of tall buildings across London which simply wouldn't exist.
I think, you're asking me we're talking about a specific planning application. You're asking me to make extraordinarily general comments. no doubt in an effort to get me to contradict myself.
No. If I could just let me just be clear as to what I'm getting at, because a repeated theme of your case against these proposals is that at 17 stories, one isn't respecting and enhancing local character. And I'm just trying to understand the boundaries of your notion, your concept of respecting and enhancing. And I think we've got it now, to be honest. I think we've got it now, which is that respect and enhance, as far as you're concerned, means being the same or similar, not that different from that which exists. I think that's your notion. Is that right, first of all? Have I caught your...
It's right in the context of Purley. However, let me add a further point. Then there are some places in London, take London as an example, I'm a London MP, where, one might... Conceivably, there are places where you could build a tall building and it could be the first tall building. So, to give an example, since you're asking me general questions, Docklands in the 1980s was the Canary Wharf area, was an industrial wasteland. The first building, whatever it's called, Canada, what's the name of it? The big one with the triangle on top. That was clearly the first tall...
Number one, I think.
Number one, there we are, that's an imaginative name. Clearly that was the first tall building built in the Canary Wharf area. Now, and that obviously was out of character with a derelict wasteland. Now, had I been the local MP for Poplar and Limehouse, or wherever the constituency is, in 1989, I would have supported it, because clearly it was a derelict wasteland, it was regenerating an area, it was, that would have been appropriate. But clearly, that is not what Purley is today. So I think in answering the question, if your question is it permissible, or do I think it's reasonable to build the first tall building somewhere? In some places, like Docklands in 1989, clearly it is. In the City of London, which is a central business district, clearly it is. So whoever built the first tall building in the City of London in 1950 or whenever, I wouldn't take issue with that, because it is a central business district. But Purley is neither an industrial wasteland, nor is it a central business district. And it is for that reason that I think it's out of character and out of keeping, and it far exceeds reasonable boundaries.
I'm letting you elaborate your points, but the point was simply trying to establish what you mean by respect and enhance, and I think we've got that now. Good. So with that in mind, we are now going to go, as you rightly predicted, to the emerging detailed plan, and you've got it on screen. This is CLP2, that's right.
And let me take a guess, DM44.
And it's DM44, that's right, because as you know, that's the detailed policy that deals with this issue.
It's open in front of me.
Yeah, and you'll know very well how the chain continues. So London Plan, having said let's be plan-led, the local plan 1, give it an imaginative designation, local plan 1, Croydon local plan 1, says what it just says about encouraging tall buildings in district centres. If you want the detail of that, look to the next plan, and this is the next plan. And as you know, because you've quoted it yourself, we are told in DM 44.1, item, at the first few words, within Purley District Centre and its environs, within District Centre and its environs, item B, and it's the latter part of it, we're told there's a potential for a new landmark of up to a maximum of 16 stories. Now, can I just understand this? Plainly, you disagree with that wholeheartedly. You're nodding your head.
Yes. I disagree with the factual premise that the current building heights are 3 to 8 floors.
I'm going to interrupt you. I'm not asking you about that. You well know I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking you about the latter part, which is a potential for a new landmark of up to a maximum of 16 stories. And we're all entitled to our opinions, and your opinion is one which disagrees with that proposition.
Well, I would be a little careful about putting it quite so boldly.
Really?
I am of the general opinion that a 16 floor, or 17 floor in this case, building is out of character with Purley Town Centre, but I would add the caveat that were another application to be made for another building of this size in Purley, I would of course study it carefully on its merit. So I would not say, I'm not sort of signing a blank cheque that just says any building of 16 floors, I get as far as 16 floors and then just say no, I'm against it. I would consider it very carefully.
That's not my question with respect, Mr. Phillips. My question to you was the wording here in the detailed plan that there is a potential for a new landmark of up to a maximum of 16 stories in Purley District Centre. Certainly my understanding of your position is that you would disagree with that formulation. There is a potential for a new landmark of up to, if you don't disagree with that, that's fine.
Yeah.
Look, but I thought you'd disagree.
I would generally disagree with that. However, my opinion on the policy is not germane to consideration of this application. We're talking about a specific application here.
Well, that's...
I mean, who cares what I think about the policy? It's irrelevant.
Well, that's not quite right with respect, because the next question I'm going to ask you is, did you object to this policy through the plan-making process?
Well, goodness me. I mean, my office handles thousands of pieces of correspondence every month, but speaking from memory, so I can't give you a completely categorical answer, but I would have expected that I would have objected, yes.
Right.
But so I'm sort of 90% sure, but
that's fine.
I'd need to check.
That's fine, and if you wanted to submit via the programme officer an email later on just confirming whether you did or didn't, I mean, the council can check themselves.
The programme officer's the lady behind you.
Yeah. The council can check for themselves whether you're on
Yeah,
record.
well, why don't they check for themselves?
They
I don't see why it's relevant, my opinion on the plan.
Well, it's relevant in this sense. It's relevant in this sense that this process of making a plan is a process that goes through giving the public, including you, the ability to object to whatever's said in the emerging plan. And it isn't at the say-so of Croydon Council whether the plan should be as it is. As you'll know, I'm sure, there is an independent process, well, a process where an independent inspector literally examines the plan, the points that have been made against it and for it, and recommends whether it should stay as it is or be modified. Do you see? You're aware of that, aren't you?
I am, but since you're raising a question of the sort of democratic legitimacy of the detailed local plan...
No, I'm not raising that. Isn't my question to you at all. Just follow along with me if you be so kind. There's a process which has an independent scrutiny by an inspector, and you and anyone else who wishes to can object to policies like this or any other policy in the plan, and that independent inspector will consider those points and form a view about them. Now, and so therefore your views as to whether the policy is a good policy or a bad policy, if you like, are relevant in that sense. That's why I've asked you whether you participated in the plan-making process.
I did,
Do you see? Yeah.
I did.
Yeah, good. Now then, so
what's the question?
with that, my question is this, and it's a very similar point as I put to the residents' associations yesterday. By the time the Secretary of State comes to make his decision in this case, we'll hear more about this from the Council, but by the time the Secretary of State comes to make his decision in this case in several months' time, the likelihood is that this detailed plan will be an adopted part of the development plan. And if it has a statement of this nature in it, then the reality of the position is that the argument of principle as to whether Purley is an appropriate location for a landmark tall building would have been had and lost. That's the point that I want to put to you, Mr. Phil. Do you see?
I do indeed see your point. However, I disagree with it. And let me explain why. There are probably three limbs to my disagreement. You mentioned that the plan may be adopted. It's, as you say, an emerging plan. It hasn't been adopted. It is, of course, a matter of speculation as to whether or not it will have been adopted by the time you indicate. So I don't think it's particularly sound to base an argument on that speculation. But even if it were adopted, or even if the inspector decided to assume that it would be adopted,
No, I wouldn't do that. It's the Secretary of State's decision.
Okay. But even if you... So I would firstly challenge your assertion or assumption that it will get adopted. But even if it was adopted, I've got probably three other points to make. You've sort of described the plan-making process as if it confers sort of definitive legitimacy. And since you've raised the point of process, I will comment. I hadn't intended to, but since you raised the question of process, I will comment on the sort of political context, though I hadn't intended to. Croydon has a Labour-controlled council. This area is mostly represented by Conservatives, and the plan some elements of the plan, including this one, and some planning applications, including this one, got rammed through by the Labour-dominated committee. So I don't, as a representative of Croydon South, which is 1/3 of the borough, I don't feel this process represents my views or the views of the residents I represent. They were disregarded by the council, who represent a much bigger area. We're only 1/3 of Croydon as a whole. So I don't accept that the plan-making process in any way, that my views are somehow accounted for in the plan-making process. My views were not accounted for. My views were by and large ignored, and I know precisely by whom is sitting in this room. But I would make two further points.
Just for 1 second, sorry,
Yes.
perhaps if we take them one by one, and I won't try and obviously stop you making your other points, but let's deal them one by one.
Okay.
So that point that you've just made, forgive me, the political point, the grandstanding, if you like, you're ignoring in that the independent inspector who has examined that detailed plan. And the independent inspector, with the clues in the name, independent. And the independent inspector won't apply any political view to this, Labour, Conservative, or heaven forbid DUP or whatever it might be. The independent inspector is just going to look at whether the policy makes sense in planning terms. Do you see? So there's a control valve there. So all this political stuff that you're banging on about is all beside the point when it comes to the independent inspector in that process. Do you see?
I see the point you're making, and I understand the point, obviously, but I don't accept. If your point you were making a moment ago seemed a little different, which is that my views have been my views are spoken for in the plan-making process, and I just wanted to say that I don't think they have.
No, that wasn't my point.
Okay.
My point was that everyone's had the opportunity to make their views known about this policy through the plan-making process. Not for Croydon, whatever political colour they might be, not for Croydon to say, oh, yes, we agree, no, we disagree, but rather for an independent inspector, completely divorced from political considerations, if they've come into play here at all, completely divorced from political considerations, to decide whether the plan should move forward to adoption with this policy in it. That's how your views are taken into account and considered, do you see? And someone's going to win or lose that debate. Someone's going to win or lose it, because there can't be a position in between. And the Secretary of State, when he comes to make his decision, will know whether this plan has been adopted or not. And if it has been adopted with this policy in it, then the debate would have been lost. Yeah. It's as simple as that, Mr. Fox. Do you see?
I do see.
Good.
Shall I proceed to my
proceed to your next one, please?
On your point about Secretary of State deciding, that is, of course, the legal formalism, but I understand that the convention is that in every case, every recommendation ever made by a planning inspector to the Secretary of State in this sort of matter, the Secretary of State accepts the planning inspector's recommendation.
No, not at all.
That's plainly
Absolutely
wrong.
not at all. No.
That's plainly wrong. The Secretary of State, sometimes to my pleasure and sometimes to my displeasure, does every now and again disagree with inspectors.
It's rare, isn't it? Very rare.
It's in the minority of cases.
Small minority.
I should say it's less than 10%.
Yes, small minority. Okay, look, my other 2 points in relation to the plan are, firstly, the plan refers to a potential. So, again, I think that is a weak formulation. It doesn't say there should be a building here. It simply refers to the potential. So the mere presence of the reference to a potential doesn't mean any particular application should be granted. And that leads me on to my final point.
Can I just deal with that point? Forgive me,
Certainly.
just as you've made it, and we'll come to your final point next. So the potential, the word potential, well, we all know, I hope, what the word potential means. But just help me with this. The plan saying there's a potential for a landmark building up to 16 stories in Purley District Centre, that statement is fundamentally inconsistent with the argument that Purley is an inappropriate location for a tall building, full stop. It's fundamentally inconsistent with that, isn't it?
Which is why, which actually comes very nicely onto my...
Is that right?
Well, that's a matter of definitional opinion in your
No,
so you can provide that definition more readily than I can.
No, I'm asking you a question. It's a very simple point. A plan which says, or a statement which, to this effect, Purley, there's the potential for a landmark 16-storey building in Purley. That statement is fundamentally inconsistent with the argument that Purley is an inappropriate location for a tall building. That's the point.
But that is not the basis of my objection.
I don't mind whether it is or it isn't, but can you answer my question? That statement is fundamentally inconsistent with the notion that Purley is an inappropriate location for a tall building, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Good, thank you. What's your last point?
Well, my last point is it deals exactly with that. Even if you accept, as you obviously do, that there is potential, or as the applicant obviously does, that there is potential for a tall, or it's acceptable in general terms to have a tall building in Purley, any particular application, including this one, needs to be assessed against a range of specific criteria, because that, in principle, potential for a big building statement is qualified. It is qualified, I think, in two places. It's qualified by sections B and C of 7.7 of the London Plan. The policy is not saying build a 16-storey building, do what you like. It's saying there's potential for a 16-storey building subject to the points in 7.7 B and C, and also subject to the points in SP 4.6. So even if you accept, as you obviously do, that there is generally potential for a 16-storey building, any particular application, including this one, has to demonstrate that it meets the tests laid out in London Plan 7.7 B and C and SP 4.6. And my case I wasn't in my submission and my objection seeking to argue with the general principle, although I disagree with it. That's not the basis for my objection, because me disagreeing with the policy is sort of irrelevant. I mean, the policy is what the policy is. That's not the basis for me objecting to this application. My basis for objecting to the application is that this specific application on this site before us today doesn't meet those criteria, and the plan potential is still subject to those criteria.
We're back, aren't we, to this point about respecting and enhancing local character.
Which is a matter of opinion.
Exactly. Of course it's a matter of opinion. That's the key part of your argument, and if you like, our counter-argument. But let's just pick that point up as you've made it again. Let's just pick that point up and run with it for a few more moments. Help me with this. The statement in the detailed local plan that Purley is, that there's potential for a 16-storey landmark building in Purley, that statement is fundamentally inconsistent with the notion that being 4 or 5 times greater than the prevailing height in Purley means that you can't respect and enhance the local character of the area. They're fundamentally inconsistent, aren't they? Once you say that there's potential for a 16-storey building in Purley, you're giving a big clue that it can't be right to say, well, just because you're 4 times, 5 times greater than what exists at the moment, that's bad. Do you see my point?
Well, I do see your point, but as I say, my point is that this specific building is out of character, owing to its particular location, which is very central, owing to its sort of domineering. I mean, we haven't really talked about the details of the design, but it has, I'm sure you'll cover that in another session, but it has a very large bulk, it has a domineering appearance. Because it's very central, it's right in the heart of Purley, it will have an unusually dominating effect. So my objection is not a general objection. It is to say that this specific building, owing to its excessive height, when read in the context of its location, its specific location, and its specific design, does not respect and enhance the character of the area.
So on the design point, do you, having praised the residents' associations, the 7 residents' associations' work at the beginning of your piece earlier on, do you disagree with the position that was put forward by the Residents' Association yesterday, that if the principle of a tall building is found to be acceptable on this site, if it is, that the design, the detailed design of this scheme is quote-unquote excellent? Do you disagree with that?
Yes. That is, of course, a matter of aesthetic taste. It's very personal, it's very objective, and of course, 10 different people will have 10 different opinions. That's perfectly natural and to be expected. But I'm not a fan of the aesthetic form being proposed, nor of the bulk, nor of the massing, since you ask.
Good. Excellent. In any of your website publicity in relation to this scheme, are you aware whether you've ever actually used any images of the scheme that we propose? Because every time we've looked at your publicity material, your website material, your flyers and so on, you constantly use material which relates to an earlier version of the scheme, actually a pre-application version of the scheme. have you ever actually used, to your knowledge, images of the scheme that we propose? There was a lengthy presentation yesterday of the scheme as it actually is, and we're not at all sure that you've ever actually caught up in your publicity, if you like, I was going to say propaganda, in your web page with what we actually propose. Yes, it's a tall building, but it doesn't actually look like the images that you've put forward in your material.
I think the use of a word like propaganda is rather unbecoming a man who is a
It
Queen's
was
Counsel.
withdrawn, so let's move away from that. Quiet, please. That was withdrawn, so let's move away from that and stick to the question. Would you like to repeat it, please, Mr. Cathcart?
Yes, I will withdraw the word. Let's deal with it in this way. Are you conscious of ever having used images of the scheme that we actually propose in your material that you've made public in relation to seeking objections to these proposals? Because as far as we're aware, the images that you've used repeatedly have been, in the main, images of, but even pre-application versions of the scheme.
Yes, well, as I understand it, the building being proposed now, I believe, speaking from memory, but I believe it's 1 floor taller, 17 rather than 16 floors, compared to the pre-app version. So it is true that in the publicity used prior to the application and subsequently, I may have slightly understated the size of the building.
It's not that you've actually...
Quiet, please.
No, you've actually overstated its width because you've used images of one of the options that was considered and rejected way before the application was made. Mr. Phillips, that's the point.
If you're seeking to insinuate, that the images are in any way materially misleading, that is wholly untrue and rather offensive.
Well, forgive me, it's not wholly untrue. Whether it's offensive or not is another matter. It happens to be correct that the images that you've used, in the main, have been images of an earlier option that was rejected, not even showing the architectural detailing we propose, but
Indeed.
We'll move on. I notice the time. There is just one related point to this, and then it would be a convenient point for a break, so if you don't mind.
Thank you, yes, please.
So, it's simply this. I'm on the 4th page, I think, of your written statement, just in case, your 5th page of your written statement, just in case you're wondering where we are in the flow of your arguments. And it's the point on the 5th page, just before you get to density, do you see on that page, where
Yes.
you make the point that the views that you've expressed about a proposal being 4 to 5 times taller than any other building in Purley is not respectful of the character of the area, etc., etc. You say that it's relevant to note that you're supported in that by the opinions of local people. Do you remember that point?
The majority.
The majority, absolutely, yes.
I don't claim every single person.
Yeah, well, whether it is the majority or not, by those who object, basically. Now, you said that public opinion isn't, you recognise it's not a material consideration. Can we perhaps just get the ground rules right? Public opinion is relevant in planning cases depending on what people say. So if the point relates to planning matters, and it's to be taken into account by the inspector in writing his report and the Secretary of State in making his decision. It depends whether the point that's made is a planning point or not. So opinions about whether 17 stories is appropriate or inappropriate, those are planning matters. So we're not in any way seeking to argue that what the public has got to say is irrelevant.
Good.
What we're seeking to do is to tackle the points that have been made.
Good.
Now, but having said that, yes, thank you. The polite request is welcome. Having said that, planning doesn't work on a show of hands. You'll understand that, won't you? So, if the fact of the matter is that 2 times X oppose and 1 times X support, that doesn't mean that that's the answer to the equation. Do you see? It's not a show of hands. It depends on the quality or substance of the points which are made.
I'm fully aware.
Good. Now, with all of that said, in your recitation of those who are against the proposals, do you remember the 7 residents' associations, you are the MP, etc., 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 and on the other side of the equation, in your written statement and in your oral statement, you refer to the 1 residents' association, you made some comments about that, and 1 business association. The business association is Purley Bid, as I understand it. That's the one you're referring to. Now, you missed out in your recitation 2 other democratically elected bodies, Croydon Council and the Mayor of London. both of whom strongly support. Now, if we're going to do this, if we're going to play this game of saying, well, let's look at the democratically elected people who are against the proposals, we should also bring into the equation, shouldn't we, those of a different view, also democratically elected, should we not? In fairness.
Well, in fairness, you're quite right to point out the view of Croydon Council, who obviously granted the planning application in the first place, and indeed the Mayor of London, who rubber stamped it.
I'm going to interrupt you there. There's no question of rubber stamping, and I don't know whether you meant...
Who approved it?
Thank you.
Who approved it? But I would respectfully point out that those bodies, as you say, it's not an opinion poll contest, but since you raised the point, those bodies derive their mandate from an area substantially not comprised of Purley. You know, most of my mandate as a local MP comes from Purley and its immediate surroundings. Sadiq Khan, as Mayor of London, his mandate derives from the whole of London, so elected by people in Enfield and Harrow and goodness knows where. Similarly, Croydon Council's mandate partly derives from around here, although I would observe that none of the councillors in the ruling group are elected from this neighbourhood, but the mandate they have derives largely from entirely from other parts of the borough. So if you're looking to get a gauge on local opinion, and I think if you're trying to assess whether a building fits in or not, it's local opinion that you should listen to. Croydon Council and the GLA, or the Mayor of London, are the least local bodies. The most local bodies are the residents' associations, me as the MP, local councillors, and our local London Assembly member. So I think the views I'm giving you are much closer to Purley than, say, the Mayor of London, who's really quite distant.
Yes. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I'm not quite sure that the consequence follows that you want it to, because if you think about it, ultimately this decision will be made by the Secretary of State, who has nothing to do with Purley or Croydon. Do you see?
I do. Well, I deeply regret the fact that this matter had to get called in and it's ended up with a planning inspector. I wish that Croydon Council had listened to their local residents more carefully at the outset, and had they done so, this entire process would have not been necessary.
Well, perhaps they just...
We'll adjourn now until 5 to 12. The inquiry is adjourned.
Thank you.